Welcome, everyone. I am so fortunate to be here with two people who are a lot smarter than I am as it relates to AI. I'll let them introduce themselves. My name is Colin. I'm the president of field operations at ReliaQuest. I've been working at ReliaQuest for 17 years. I've done work in running security operations, product and development, and today I get to spend a lot of time with our customers. I'd like to kick it over to our guest, Allie. Do you mind giving a quick introduction to yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm really thrilled to be here. My name is Allie Mellen. I'm a principal analyst on the security and risk team at Forrester, and I cover security operations. So all things people, process, technology in the SOC, including detection engineering. I also cover nation state threats and what we're talking about today, AI and its use in security tools. So very excited to be here. I have been with Forrester for 4 years now, a little over 4 years. And my background is in computer engineering. I was a computer engineer before becoming a hacker and then a security practitioner.
It's awesome. We're so happy to have you. Thanks for being here. And Mr. Partlow.
Yeah, Joe Partlow here, Chief Technology Officer for ReliaQuest. I've been here at ReliaQuest, I think in my 15th year, but been in InfoSec and cybersecurity for 25 plus years or so. So glad to be joining with you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. So today we're going to be talking a lot about AI. Obviously, AI is a major buzzword and a huge kind of game-breaking capability that's come to market and really picked up speed over the last couple of years. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what is it, how customers are viewing it today, the future of AI, and all things in between. So pumped to get started. And I think to kick us off, both Allie and Joe, you guys talk to customers all the time who are asking about AI. And I'd love to maybe start, Allie, with you. What are you hearing from customers today around AI? Like, how are they thinking about it? How are they seeing it?
Yeah, it's so interesting. In my 4 years at Forrester, the most interest I've seen in a new technology has been around generative AI with CISOs. And initially, that was really exciting because CISOs are very skeptical people. Security practitioners as a whole are very skeptical. But they were really excited about what was possible with it, how it was going to change security operations. And unfortunately, they've been let down. Hearts have been broken because what we've seen is that, at least in the last 2 years or so, the innovations that have been happening with generative AI have been okay, but nothing really groundbreaking or impressive. Now, one of the things that I'm most excited about is I think that we have reached the point where vendors have put stuff into the tools. They put generative AI capabilities in there just to say they have it. And now we can get to the really cool and impressive stuff. So I'm hoping that we get a second wind of excitement and energy here. But that's kind of the current state that we see at Forrester right now.
Absolutely, yeah. And Joe, you've been talking AI for the last 3.5, 4 years of ReliaQuest AI journey. What do you hear from customers?
Yeah, I think even further than that, Colin, we've been trying to push machine learning and AI for probably the past 7 or 8 years. But it's really only until the last kind of few it's been interesting and really got operationalized enough. But to your point, customers have been a little slow to kind of initially catch on. I think a lot of that's kind of due to a lot of the FUD that's out in the market, right? There's a lot of hype on how well it works, how well it doesn't work. There's not a lot of kind of real tests or real demos that people can see, from a lot of their vendors. And I think there's a lot of unrealistic expectations in a lot of cases where the customer may have too high of expectations, and obviously the market may not be there yet. But I also think there's some underestimating too of the real power of kind of what we can do with this when it's done right. Obviously, we'll get into kind of some of the factors that make that successful or not. But that's certainly something that I think. To Allie's point, the CISOs really want this. And, I've got a lot of smart data scientists and cybersecurity people that have been doing this for a long time, and they're extremely excited about this. And customers that have been in this also that have been around that as well. So, there's just kind of, I think a confusion and concern around the data security is probably the biggest thing of they really like the idea of it. I think they do underestimate the power of kind of, they haven't seen the true power of what could happen yet. Certainly some of the research that we've seen has been pretty cool. So I don't think they've seen that yet. And there's a lot of doubt on how secure that's going to be.
Yeah, totally. One of the things that I think you stated and has definitely shown up a lot in the market and the conversations I've had with customers is, AI is kind of a broad term, which covers everything from machine learning all the way through what is now agentic AI, and who knows what will be next. Maybe could Allie and Joe talk about it together, but talk us a little bit about kind of like that, the versioning and capability as you see machine learning to generative AI to now what is agentic AI, and like how you've seen that evolution, and how should customers and how should security professionals be thinking about it when somebody says AI? How do they evaluate what is it exactly, and how far along and how advanced is it really?
Yeah, this is a great question because in a lot of cases we're seeing machine learning rebranded as generative AI, and so it comes up a lot for me with clients who are trying to understand, okay, what are the actual generative AI capabilities versus what we see traditionally with machine learning? Machine learning is really, really great for not very complex sequences compared to what generative AI is capable of, and identifying what's going to be next in them, or what's going to be most likely to cluster in a specific way. There are a couple of different types of machine learning. We could get into like supervised versus unsupervised and the differences there. But ultimately, it's been really effective for a long time for practitioners looking at doing things like creating new detections based on the analytics that you can get from machine learning. Or one thing that I think is actually cooler is validating the detections that have been created and saying, is this actually accurate based on what we're seeing? Those have been some great use cases for machine learning, things like risk scoring or identifying whether or not threat intelligence is actually valuable. You can apply it in lots of different ways there. Now, this differs significantly from what we see with generative AI, which is really about looking at a very complex sequence of events and saying what comes next in this very complex sequence. This is great for human language, which we've seen in part because human language is extremely complex. English especially, but other languages too. I mean, with Gen Z popping in, creating new words every 5 seconds, it has a lot to keep up with, just like we all do. And ultimately, because it's so good with these complex sequences, it's good at language, but it can be good at other complex sequences as well. And that to me is where we get into some cool use cases.
Yeah, early on, I think, a lot of people saw the kind of the power of cybersecurity and a use for kind of machine learning and the dream of AI. But to your point, Colin, like everybody calls it something different. That doesn't help at all. But I do think, obviously, agentic and generative AI has kind of got all the glory in the past few years. I do think there's still a place for traditional machine learning. When you look at some of those core concepts of, searching through big data sets, maybe that's for threat hunting, things like that, finding those outliers, there's still going to be some of that. I think it's a mix right now because you're going to want to use something generative to probably summarize that data. And obviously it's really kind of accelerated in the past few years. I think a couple of years ago, you had kind of that single workflow, or maybe it was just a generative summarization by a single model. Maybe last year, people started kind of introducing the notion of an agent where it's, doing single threaded tasks, minimal additional context. Maybe there's some documents that it's reading in to really kind of full blown agentic, which is, I think, what we really see this year, where you've got kind of this autonomous orchestrated multiple agents communicating with each other and carrying out different tasks, maybe with independent models that they're using or kind of full blown personas. So super exciting to kind of where we're heading. And I think we've just barely scratched the surface.
Yeah, so let's dive into that, because I think we've seen some commercials with actors talking about agentic AI and AI agents and everything else. Like, help me and our audience maybe better understand, like, what is agentic AI, right? And you talked a little bit about how you you look at generative versus agentic, but like, what is agentic AI and what is an orchestrator, and like how should people be thinking about that?
Yeah, we actually released very recently a definition from Forrester. And one of the benefits that I have is that I am not just sitting here scrawling or researching things and assuming that it's correct based on my own experience. We have a lot of analysts within Forrester that are covering generative AI and the changes happening there. So I get to piggyback off of their very cool research. and question it and give them feedback so that we can make sure that we're giving accurate descriptions of the technologies that we're seeing. And so the way that Forrester defines agentic AI is as systems of foundation models, rules, architectures, and tools which enable software to flexibly plan and adapt to resolve goals by taking action in their environment with increasing levels of autonomy. I realized that was a big mouthful. So the bottom line to me is, especially as a takeaway of this report, is that agentic AI is ultimately about having an agent or a series of agents that can take action autonomously, that they can plan, they can understand, they can adapt to situation without human intervention, which is really ideally where we want to get for very specific tasks so that we can accomplish them and have the machines support us in doing that. What do you think of that?
Very
Yeah.
technical.
Yeah. I think the term agentic is going to change definitions a little bit, right? Because I think what people called it last year when it first kind of got the hype really didn't do it justice, right? You know, if you had one agent and it was just a chat bot, people were saying, oh, we've got agentic, where, you know, I think it definitely sells itself short. You've got to have kind of that autonomous piece. It's got to be multi-agent, in my opinion, to kind of really make sure that it's agentic. So I think, you know, throughout this year especially, things are on such a fast pace that I think, you know, as vendors and trusted partners and kind of whatever your role is with your customer, I think we're going to have to kind of educate and really almost force the definition a little bit, because there is going to be a lot of hype out there about, hey, I'm agentic. Well, no, not really. If you really want to do it right, you know, this is kind of what that means. So, yeah, I think some of these concepts we've kind of, make sure that we're getting across to the customer and really kind of let them know, like, hey, this is kind of the true power of where we're taking this.
So you both kind of touched on this a little bit, but there's this idea of an agent that's built for kind of a purpose-built function, right? But then there are governing agents or orchestrators, right, that are helping to move this. So, you know, if you're talking to a customer today and they're being pitched or talked about an agentic capability, how do you evaluate like the level of sophistication of said agentic capability? And like, you know, the next question, if you guys want to answer now or want to answer then. So how do you evaluate the level of agentic? And then like, how do you start to get to like, is this needed to the outcome, right? Is this like, what is the outcome that this is going to provide to me?
Yeah, it's a great point, because when we look at a lot of, to Joe's point, when we look at a lot of what people are releasing and claiming is agentic, it's just like, okay, this is just either machine learning or an AI agent, which is just not the same. And it's very important that there's a differentiation here because of that level of autonomy. And so when I look at this, the first thing that I look at is a human sitting there giving you an up or down, whether or not this is the right answer? And how often does a human have to do that? Because of course, there's always, to a certain extent, you're going to need that capability, right? But if you are having to direct the AI agents and in their process of coming to a decision to a significant degree, like we see right now with a lot of LLMs and like we see with a lot of implementations of AI agents, then that's not agentic. It should be giving you a much more accurate answer and understanding of what's happening in the scenario, and ideally presenting it with some type of score that indicates how confident it is in that response. To me, that's one of the biggest gaps that we have with both AI agents and agentic AI right now, is that a lot of it is dependent on the user saying this is good or bad. It's not dependent on the AI to provide us with a confidence score and say, we're pretty sure that this is the reality, much like a human would give you a confidence score and say, I think that this is what's happening. And so that, to me, is one of the things that everyone should be on the lookout for, is how are they evaluating success with the agentic architecture that they've built? How are they evaluating that the output is correct for the business use case and for your specific security team's use case?
That makes a lot of sense. I just want to double click on maybe some kind of key questions you can ask when you're evaluating agentic AI. So one, what I heard is it should take the process through multiple steps, not just one step, right? I did want to just double click as you're looking at that, you know, what's the level of feedback that you feel like should be given and like should be on the customer versus not when it is an agentic real agentic type solution? Like, should you be expected, you mentioned not having to give feedback on each step, but maybe giving feedback on the outcome? Like, how do you think about that?
I do think that the feedback on the outcome is a big part of this, and the level of efficacy is a big part of it as well. Like, these systems should be, we often see them working with like a judge and a critic, right? And that is so that the judge can make a determination, is this the right output? And the critic can say, is this ethical? Is this biased? Is this the way that we expect the output to become? And that combination working together helps to refine the output of the overall system. If that is not happening to a certain degree and to the point where you can get a complex outcome very reliably, then you're likely not dealing with a agentic system. Further, if you have to prompt the system, then you're not really dealing with an agentic system, because these are set up to do very specific tasks. They typically run when they need to run, or maybe there's a button that says you need to run this activity, and most of that is just for pricing and that type of thing. But it's very limited on what human interaction should look like. But I don't know, Joe, you've seen this up close. So how have you guys been approaching it?
No, I definitely agree. And I like the kind of to looking at it from the outcome first, right? Because there's going to be, every vendor's going to do this different. There's a lot of pros and cons of, okay, is this true agentic? How did you implement it? What did you do? And really at the end of the day, I don't think the customer cares or is probably going to know, right? All I want to know is, hey, I want to automate this task, and can I get there? So I think it's kind of up to us to educate and say, all right, well, hey, to do this right, this is kind of what needs to happen. And I think all of what you mentioned comes into play where, can I give it feedback? Is it spawning off things autonomously, or do I have to kind of, prompt it, human in the loop for every single thing? So I think all of those things together should be transparent to the customer for the most part, or for the end user. And then obviously for those of us building it, we'll have to kind of worry about that. But there's a lot of nuts and bolts of kind of, hey, is that kind of true agentic? But I think, being able to kind of get that outcome of, like you said, I shouldn't have to prompt this thing and have it continue on unless I really want to force it to stop that. It should be coming up with new ideas and new suggestions and new ways of doing things without me having to say that. Because if I have to do it, then I might as well just do it, right? So that's the whole goal, is I don't know what I don't know. So, think of things and think of, environmental things that maybe I'm not looking at, and take action on that without me having to kind of say so. So I think it all has to come back to, what is that well-defined use case, and what's the outcome we expect? And you mentioned measurement, and that's got to be key, right? Is this performing well? Is it, how good can we tell? We've got some way to measure, is the outcome good or not? Because I don't know if we can always depend on the end user. They may not know any different either, and it's much better than what they had. But is it as good as it could be? Maybe not.
Yeah, and I want to go into efficacy. Before I do that, like, Allie, you made this comment, and Joe, you kind of alluded to it. I think many times we see agentic systems using multiple LLMs. And when a customer is evaluating an agentic AI solution, what are some basic questions that you would ask or you would recommend asking to better understand, like, the data, the LLMs, the models that they're using? Are there multiple models? Are they private models? Are they public models? Maybe, Allie, I know you talk to customers all the time about this, and then Joe, you as well. What are some just like 3 to 4 questions that you should be asking that are going to help you, get more knowledgeable and get more kind of usable information out of those vendors?
Yeah, so definitely, what is the expected output for each scenario that this is operating under? I completely agree that asking what models are being used is extremely important, especially from a security and privacy consideration point of view. I also do think that it's important to ask it, or to ask the team that is operating it, what is like the worst case scenario output look like? If this goes wrong, what is it going to do to my existing systems? Because while most of the implementations that I'm seeing today are more focused on triage, they're more focused on investigation, if this goes into response, we're talking about a different ballgame, and we need to be very careful that it doesn't affect anyone's enterprise and infrastructure in a negative way. The other factor here is the efficacy question, which is, how do you know the results is accurate? And I completely agree with you both here. Like, one of the things that annoys me the most about how AI agents and agentic is being presented is, we've gone and told all of these people, you can train your new personnel on this AI agent and on this tool and the output that it's giving you. But then we expect them to be the ones that are giving the thumbs up or thumbs down as to whether or not it's working. That's crazy. That's crazy. Why are we trusting the newbies who are supposed to be learning from this thing as to whether or not it's the right answer or a good answer? It doesn't make any sense. So that is a big part of it too, is even if they don't have a direct answer for how they're measuring efficacy, at the very least, how are you testing this? What have you done to make sure that you're testing this accurately? Which comes down to looking at samples of the data, better understanding the output. It's also really important to ask, how, with the data that you have, how did you get it? And how did you decide that this is the right data to be training this on? Because one of the things that concerns me is there are a set of vendors that have access to a ton of data that they may have labeled over the years, which is awesome because you have a bunch of insight into exactly what steps an AI agent or agentic system should be taking. But then there's a whole other set of vendors that are newer to the field. They don't have that same level of data. And so I keep coming back to, what are they training this on? What are they predicating the responses that are coming out of this on? And so that's a big part of this too, is what is the data that you're using and how did you come to that decision?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I just, the questions that we get are probably along those same lines, and the same thing that I would ask if I was consuming AI, right, is, it's got to be, you've got to trust it. And a lot of the things, that we're talking about here kind of lead into that trust. So I've got to be able to trust that it's consistent. I got to trust that it's not hallucinating, getting the right results or getting the wrong results. And there's some levers that we can do to tweak and tune that. And I think most customers, as long as they can trust and have that full transparency, and maybe they give feedback, maybe they don't, but they have the option to it. And we have some levers to kind of, tweak and tune it where it makes sense. That's kind of what we get, is kind of what they really want, is they want to be part of it and they want to, help kind of model it to their environment. And there's some things that we can do for that. But obviously the data is key, right? If you do not have that data set to either train or to make available for context, that's going to basically kill your app. And then the trust for that too. Obviously for us, automation is kind of one of our biggest use cases. And that makes or breaks what we can automate if we don't have that context. Nobody is going to want us to isolate a host, reset a user password, take some action if we don't know what that user or that host is. So having that data, having that context is kind of the number one thing for us, being able to kind of, whether it's training it or augmenting it real time with that context.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, when it comes to efficacy, it's obviously a little bit easier to judge efficacy of the models when you have it live and you have it running in production. What are some just kind of basic questions you guys would ask when you're evaluating it? And then Joe, maybe first Allie, what are some basic questions you advise people asking on, like, how do you find out about efficacy? And then Joe, maybe talk to us a little bit about how you manage the models and the efficacy of models, within what you've built.
Yeah, it's twofold. So first is looking at the actual model that they're using. So what resources have they either reviewed or what testing have they done themselves of the specific model that they've chosen to operate everything that they're building on, right? Because that's a big question that decides how effective the model is going to be. The second question that I would ask is, how are you actually doing the testing of the output of your technology? And that's where the answers can get really bad. I'll be honest. It can run the gamut from, we're relying on users, to we have a team that is dedicated to looking at the output and actually understanding whether or not this is the best solution, and then going back and inputting this back into the system to make a determination. That is where you want to be. That's where you want the vendor that you're working with to be, is actually looking at consistently the outputs that are coming into this and making decisions based on that. The other factor here that's really interesting is, one of the things that I've seen with generative AI as a whole, especially for security teams, is it's useful for a general use case, but if you have something really specific to a specific security organization, such as recommending response actions, that is very tailored to the organization that you're talking to. Certain organizations are going to be comfortable automating certain things that other organizations are going to be like, we will never automate this, right? And so when it comes to those types of things, there needs to be some type of way. We see this most commonly with retrieval augmented generation right now, but it's okay. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Some way of getting to that organization specific level of output, which I think is one of the most challenging aspects of this, is how do we not only give the right answer, but how do we give the right answer for this specific business under these specific circumstances?
Yeah, which I think that is the holy grail, right? Because there's a lot of things that we can do to make sure the performance is there and the quality is there and all those types of things. But at the end of the day, the outcome is not going to be, it doesn't matter if it's the best performing model and what we think is good if the customer doesn't think it is that context. So there's a couple of things that we look at around that. So performance of the models, are we using the right model? Obviously, some models are better at reasoning, some are better at maybe code analysis. So having kind of this agentic platform really kind of opens that up to the possibilities where, hey, we want to use a different model for the different tasks. Now, we may still run it through GPT or something like that to summarize that data, but it's the performance of that from a quality standpoint, and then also speed, right? Obviously, since automations are our biggest use case, I can't wait 20 minutes for maybe results to come back sometimes. So do we are we not strangling resources of these models, making sure that they're correct? In some cases, that may mean, hey, let's do a private model that's been very, very specifically trained that's going to perform faster rather than some bigger commercial model. But there's also the actual input data, right? So that's kind of where you get into prompt engineering. We want to make sure that is delivering quality. Obviously, we've got our experts that kind of take a first pass at that and say, well, hey, here's what I would expect to be the outcome. Let me fine tune that maybe per alert or per technology to really kind of fine tune the answers that I'm getting back. But kind of like we talked about earlier, like there's always going to be that aspect from the customer. Well, hey, in my environment, it doesn't matter how good our model is, how good an answer that we give, if there's some other step that they have to then go through. Maybe there's some other internal regulatory compliance thing they have to take into account, or there's some other contextual piece. So I think that's kind of the holy grail. If we can add in also that layer where then whether it's RAG or open up the prompt a little bit for users that are able to do this on the customer side, so that there's kind of those three levels where, hey, this is just best practice from a performance standpoint. This is kind of our special sauce, layered on top from a vendor of kind of what we've learned in the past decade or more. And then also kind of that last piece, which is the very customer specific. And there's a lot of levers that we can do that, but every one of those, we have to test quality and performance for each one of them. Just given the critical nature that we're doing, it's not we're not generating text that we can go back and create. If we're going to take action on this, we've got to make sure that it's performing right and the quality's right.
I am curious because I've seen different approaches from different vendors on this. What type of model do you think is the most effective for this use case? Is it the reasoning model? Is it the one that's better at code generation?
Yeah, and I think it kind of depends on what your agent is doing, and I think we'll talk about kind of some of the more detailed ones of those. But I think at a high level, something like a GPT or even the latest Claude model does really well at reasoning. Now, you may want to take the output of a different model and run it through that to get kind of a better summary or second opinion, things like that. If you were doing code analysis, whether it's code assistance or maybe you're reversing a binary and you need to kind of analyze that code, we found that something like a Gemini, may work better for that type of scenario. And there's a million of them out there. I think when we were talking about kind of how do you tune and fine tune this, there's been a ton of work on what model works best, and it's a trade-off, right? Hey, this model costs 5 to 10x more than this one. Am I getting 5 or 10x more the outcome? Or hey, something like a language translation, I don't need the latest and greatest GPT-4 model for that. I can use 3.5 and it's a heck of a lot cheaper, and it still performs. Whereas something like, hey, I need an overall summary of this ticket write-up, that's something where, right now I think going for quality is better than kind of fine-tuning it for the cost. So having the ability to kind of select the right model for the right agent, I definitely think is going to be critical going forward. Forget cost, but just from a quality standpoint.
It's so crazy too, because everything is changing so quickly.
Oh yeah, and frankly, that's been the hardest part. Right, is that we'll test something, and by the time we get ready to deploy it, like, oh wait, there's a new model, and let's do that. So yeah, it has been hard to try to keep up with the sheer space.
What's interesting is there's a little bit of conflict that I just want to dig into just for the audience sake, right? Which is that, Allie, you kind of said, hey, agentic models should be somewhat I don't want to say unsupervised because it's a bad term, but they should be running someone autonomously and working through tasks, getting you an outcome, and then you may need some feedback on it. You also talked about some customer specific things that they may need to tune. Response actions was the example you used of like, hey, to take a response action, it may be very unique for my business and I need to be good about what I put in. Joe, I thought you did a nice job of kind of walking through that. You have kind of model best practices. You have, the product owner, right? In this case, ReliaQuest, right? Mm-hmm. You have kind of ReliaQuest best practices and you call it secret sauce, right? And then there's this balance of also looking for some feedback from the customer. And just for our audience, maybe, Allie, you could start with me on talking about like the level of expected interaction with the model to get the results that you would want, especially when it is being presented as an agentic model.
Yeah, definitely. So the thing is, we are moving, like the way that we talk about this internally at Forrester is that it is still a bit of a spectrum, right? We're not at the point where you can have a fully autonomous agentic AI system, and it's going to be something where you can just be like, okay, great, we have this now. We need a human in the loop for these things. And I would never, at least not at this point, recommend that any security practitioner blindly follow or blindly allow an AI agent to operate. We just don't know enough about it. We don't have enough context right now. It would just be very unnecessarily risky. And so what ideally we are moving towards is the point where these can operate completely autonomously and you can trust their output, but we're not there yet. Right. And so when I talk about the ability for them to operate without human intervention, it is in stages and it is in levels. And the core difference between what we see with AI agents versus agentic AI is how much reasoning are they doing and planning and adapting are they doing behind the scenes to make sure that the output is going to be as accurate as it can possibly be. That's really the priority here. That's the most important part. We see this, like, to give some examples of how this might look different in the real world right now, if we go outside of cybersecurity, you could see these examples with like Tesla self-driving versus Waymo, right? Tesla self-driving requires a lot of human intervention right now. I can tell you from experience, I've driven Teslas across the country several times that like you get into a construction zone, it's going to be braking and then speeding and then braking. And it can be very scary. Whereas you see these Waymo cars that are currently like driving people around San Francisco without having a human anywhere in the car. They may require some very specific instances where they need some help, but it's very limited. Now, those are also two very different scenarios. So there's a lot to consider there, right? San Francisco, where they've mapped the exact layout of the roads, is a very different scenario than me just choosing some random road in the south to go down as I try to get to my parents' house. But ultimately, the point that I'm trying to make here is that in one instance, you have something that needs a lot less human intervention than the other thing, to the point where they don't need drivers in the seats. And so those are kind of the two examples that I would give of like where on the spectrum different vehicles are if we look to that. And so you want to find something similar with the tools that you're using from a security perspective and the agentic capabilities that you're seeing. You want to get closer to the Waymo part of this, but as a part of that path, you're going to be in the Tesla, as the example goes.
That makes total sense. Yes, it does. And I think and just to double click, because like, if you're spending a lot of time in AI, you're going to hear things like, is it doing reasoning? And maybe, do you mind just maybe adding a couple of clarifying points on like, what is the difference between like an agent doing an action and then an agent doing reasoning or making decisions? Just so if you're looking at a product, you're being talked to about a capability, they can be evaluating like, is this agentic or is this just an agent? What does that mean?
Joe, do you want to start here?
Sure.
Yeah.
I realize I'm talking too much, so like I gotta
yeah. No, and that's one we struggle with a lot, right? Because if you kind of look at this, if you go back to kind of how we're talking the infrastructure, right? You've got kind of this orchestrator that may spin off multiple agents, and then that agent may have a tool set that it can call tools. So where does it warrant having a full-blown agent versus, hey, is this just a tool that an agent would call? And at what point do I spin off functionality from an agent because now it's too big or something like that? And I think it goes back to kind of what we're talking about earlier, where, right now it is kind of a hybrid state where, we're not there where we can fully make these things autonomous. But I think if you looked at, hey, I need to maybe do a threat hunt. Maybe I had one hunt agent. Maybe if I split that into two agents where one is doing the research and it's going off and gathering in threat intel, it's going out and pulling process data and all these other things, that could be kind of more fully autonomous because it's relatively a low impact, right? And it's going to pull that data back. And then maybe I then have a separate agent that is going to call and do my action specifically for that. Maybe that's, hey, push out this detection because the result of the hunt said we don't have any coverage for that. Or, hey, we don't have any alert or detection for that. So go ahead and make one and push that out. So I think that's kind of the weird state we're in right now is as we're kind of building out these use cases, when does it warrant, spinning out, splitting an agent in half so that we can get more automated without being held back by, well, hey, I don't want to let this thing loose in my environment. And maybe you're not getting the full benefit of the automation.
Yeah. And I think just to kind of bring it up to my level, when I sit in these conversations, I get a lot of the very basic questions you ask is like, hey, if the agent doesn't have the information it needs, what does it do? Right? If it comes into a position or it doesn't understand like the next steps, how does it handle it? Because to your point, and I think, your reasoning and kind of like, planning part of agentic should be able to overcome certain barriers without human intervention, where, many times I hear and I'm asked by customers about hallucinations. And I think most, not all, but many hallucinations happen because an agent is kind of independently on a solo path, doesn't have the information it needs, runs into an issue, and many times starts making things up. And so
it takes a best guess, right? It says, hey, but based off of what I know, I say this, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. So is it chained together? Is it broken apart? How is the architecture set up so that if it runs into problems, and I think it's a very basic thing. Hey, if your agentic AI runs into problems, how does it handle the problems? Like what is troubleshooting steps? And at what point does a human need to intervene? And by the way, does it have the capability to say, hey, by the way, I don't know what the answer is here, so it doesn't just start making things up or do something incorrectly.
Can it phone a friend, right? Like, can it spawn out to say, hey, I need human input on this, or hey, I can spin off another agent that I know knows the answer to bring that in. So to your point, when does it kind of replan and take a step back and say, hey, let me start over or something?
And that's the value out of the reasoning versus the very action driven. It's like reasoning doesn't have to look at something and say, okay, we're actually going to take this action. It can, to your point, phone a friend. And so you can really specialize, which is where, it's kind of like with humans where you start to get into very deep specialization so they can focus better on the task at hand.
So I want to move a little bit into use cases. And Allie, you mentioned some really good like generative use cases earlier, but as we talk about agentic AI, what are some of the better use cases in like the now or the very near term where you feel like agentic AI is just doing a great job or has a lot of possibility?
Yeah, the coolest use case that I've seen so far is being able to do some automated triage and potentially automated investigation, and just to take those steps out of the equation. This is one of the things, it's really interesting. Over the past few weeks, I've been hearing a lot more often that practitioners are struggling with alert volume, which I was like, what year is it? Like, what year are we talking about right now that we've come back around to this problem? And part of the reason is I'm hearing that there are a lot more alerts being generated and a lot of very poor contextualization of those alerts. It would be really great if you could just have a machine that looks at those and says, there's not enough contextualization here. We're going to add the contextualization and make an informed decision about whether or not this is good or bad. That would be incredibly useful. And that's the opportunity that we have here with agentic AI, is being able to either go to the point of completely automating the process of triage and potentially investigation and ultimate closing out of a ticket if it's not real, or to at least give the upfront context so that the analyst can make a better decision about that. Because the alert volume that we're facing right now is back to with a vengeance, to the point where we need support from this. I think that also comes down to some tools need to do a better job at the alerts that they're creating and why they're creating them. But either way, this is the type of thing that can be really useful to help analysts with analyst experience as a whole.
Yeah, totally agree. You got to attack it from both sides. We always talk about if there's a volume issue, it's many times detection. oftentimes like their, digital footprint is expanded well beyond, the security team, often, I've never met a CISO who says they're fully staffed or they have enough people, right? And at some point that backlog of alerts just becomes overbearing, especially as you're turning on new technologies. And Joe, maybe talk a little bit about where kind of our first step into agentic was, and now where you're thinking about. And then I got a question for the end of like, where do you guys see agentic AI in like 2 to 3 years, just so we could kind of like call out some predictions.
Yeah, I think some of the big wins or not wins, I guess, we had a couple of years ago. I think real quick we saw the power of kind of the summarization ability of kind of saying, well, hey, let me make sense of these events, or hey, I've got this obscure event code or event ID or some really obscure Kubernetes log, and maybe that takes me 20 minutes as an analyst to go look that up. We can trim all that time out. So I think real quick we saw, hey, there's a real possibility for tier 1 or tier type 2 actions or full tickets. We should be able to get rid of those. Now, that was kind of the first step, was the summarization piece. Then it was like, well, so what? What are we going to do about it? We have to make some action. And that's kind of where, I think early on, initially we kind of had one model and we said, hey, we're going to have one model to rule them all. We'll put all of our knowledge in it. And really didn't turn out that way. I think models kind of turned into a commodity real quick, and you've got to have the right model for the right job. Let's go back to the data of what we know and use agentic to kind of really fine tune what data the decisions being made on, so that we can take the right appropriate action for that. So I think early on we realized that we've got to have kind of this notion of the right model for the right job, or splitting it into tasks so that we can start chipping away at, to your point, the volume, right? Where, it's kind of 80-20 rule, right? 20% of the rules are doing 80% of the volume. So if most of those are tier 1, tier 2, really, why can't we at least get rid of the enrichment and research part of that and cut down the time? And even if the analyst still has to get involved at the very end, a 75% reduction in time to react to something is still a huge win. And for those ones that maybe it's like a port scan alert or a malware not cleaned, all right, that's a pretty low IR kind of task. We could probably go ahead and have an agent just do that. As long as we've got those guardrails where if we have to unwind it, that we can. And going back to what we talked about earlier, it's got to be transparent and we've got to have that feedback. So if something does go sideways, we've got to see kind of, well, hey, how did we get there and how do we correct going forward?
Now, one thing that I think has been interesting, and I didn't fully realize this until recently, is that many product vendors have released AI as like an add-on module that has to be paid for. Allie, I know you're very opinionated on all things. Talk to us a little bit about like, what should customers expect, right? When it comes to AI and packaging it in, Joe had mentioned earlier cost, right? Like there is an actual cost behind delivering AI capabilities, but how do you see the world across all the things that you look at?
Yeah, it's like you're trying to get me to rant here.
I don't want you to rant. I just want you to be yourself.
So this is another pain point for me, which is I talk to so many people who say that Gen AI, agentic, it's all just a requirement if we're going to be able to face today's threats, and that attackers are using it, so we need to use it too. And then they upcharge for it. And it's like, great, thanks for that. You're clearly a partner to me. You're clearly on my side with this. And so I understand on the one hand. I do think that the math around trying to figure out a pricing model that works for this is complicated. It is still very much so in flux from what I'm seeing. I mean, we saw Google start to include it as part of their Google license for just consumers for free. And we still have some other hyperscalers that are taking different approaches, all of that. So there's a wide variety of approaches that cybersecurity vendors are taking, and I think the broader market is still trying to figure out. That said, at a certain point, I do think that there's a set of agentic features, or at the very least, generative AI features that are going to have to be included as part of the price. It's not going to make sense at a certain point to be charging extra for these. Maybe there's a world where there are emerging features that are going to be a bit more and to be not included, but something that you can use as an add-on. But there's a set of features right now that are pretty commoditized across the market. Things like putting a paragraph of text into an alert, which I'd argue is not that useful anyway. or doing things like the translation example, like having a chatbot that can translate between different human languages, which is a use case we found that is incredibly helpful. Things like script analysis, those types of things, very commoditized across the market right now. Where we get into things that aren't is into agentic AI and a lot of these like auto investigation or creation of parsers, things like that. And I can see the case, at least right now, for at least finding a way to manage the costs of those a little bit better and potentially charging based on consumption or something like that. But I do think that there is a point where we need to start including these features as part of the product cost, because it just becomes a core part of the product and a core value prop of using the product. And we're getting there. How do you guys work with it?
Yeah, and Joe, I know, obviously we, ReliaQuest has enabled agentic AI across all of our customers, no additional cost. Maybe talk a little bit about like the rationale there, and how you see it, because I do think it matters, even though there is an additional cost that's being incurred.
Right. Yeah, I think so, and I definitely think there's table stakes, right? And expectation is there of, hey, if we're a partner to create this outcome, and this just gets us a better outcome, it doesn't seem right to kind of charge for that. So where I do think that you'll see some separation, right? Like if you do it right, you should be able to recognize some cost savings on the back end. Humans are going to be your biggest cost, right? So if we can eliminate some of that manual stuff and then take those same humans and maybe provide a more valuable service, that would be something that I think as a customer, I know I would rather pay for. I don't want to pay for tier 1, tier 2 anyway. So if I can take that cost and automate that out, and what I was paying for, may I even pay a little bit more, because now I can get a lot more proactive, a lot more preventative. And that same team that I was wasting time with tier 1, tier 2, now can do those things. That may be something that's worth paying for. But I agree, like AI for the sake of AI, I think is going to become transparent, and it's going to be like electricity pretty soon. You're just not going to know it's there until it doesn't work, right?
And the positive thing about that too is if you're not charging for it, then you are ideally just including features that actually make a difference,
right?
And because you have to manage the costs as a vendor. And so I think that is definitely the way to go long term, is to just figure out ways to improve your own efficiencies. If you are claiming that it's going to improve the efficiency of the customer, you can just, to your point, get it on your end too, and also enable them to get better outcomes with it.
Yeah, because the value is not the AI, right? The value is the outcome. So charging for the AI doesn't seem to make sense, right? Let's if anything, maybe we charge more for the outcome if we can get a better outcome.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the root of everything. And I chuckled myself when you said, hey, like AI is essential for you to be able to do your job, and then you got to pay more for it. I think many times AI can be like a really cool feature, really cool functionality, but what is the tangible outcome, the quantifiable outcome that's going to be delivered, and put dollars behind it. And that is the evaluation I think every business has to do when deciding whether they want to charge for something. I wanted to move a little bit into kind of predictions on the go forward. And maybe Joe, we'll start with you and then go to Allie. Obviously we're kind of into the first, call it a year of agentic AI, right? It's very much in its infancy. Joe, what are some of the things you're most excited about in the next 2 to 3 years that you think agentic AI will be a game changer in, especially around security operations?
Man, we need another hour for this. I've got such a list.
You have 2 minutes.
All right. So my top ones, I think, are, as we kind of build out, and luckily the tools and the models and everything is kind of getting there faster along with that. But I think if you look at kind of the outcome, what I want to see in the future and kind of what we're pushing for also is, how do you really kind of get more to that autonomous stage, right? Whether that's dynamically creating an agent on the fly, because based off this artifact or this behavior, I need to do this. Well, maybe I don't have an agent already done. That's, I think, table stakes where you've got to be able to spin that up. Now that could be, hey, we got to dynamically create a detection or a workflow or some sort of action. Maybe it's an agent that needs that, maybe not. So, very big on the proactive and preventative stuff to have these things dynamically generate. So I think that's kind of a big area. I think being able to really get us closer to, I don't know if we'll ever get to a fully autonomous. I don't know if we want to, right? Like security analysts now don't have that ability to just run wild and do anything that they want. So I think it all comes down to kind of the behavior and the context, and if we can get better at that. But I think, that dynamic based off of what the environment is and what's normal or not, and the baseline that we're getting, I think that's kind of the future for at least, I don't know if I'll even go out 2 to 3 years. I think in the next year, that it's progressing fast enough where we can start having workflows and detections and automations being spun up dynamically.
Skynet, Joe.
Yes.
Skynet. No, I think you're right. I think there are going to be some things that you probably do want to allow the agentic AI to kind of run a full life cycle. Everything from enrich, investigate, even to response. But I think those are going to be very selective based on kind of a known outcome that you're going to get based on certain parameters. And actually
go back to the basics, right? Like if you're not doing asset management right, if you're not doing data classification right, all these basic things, you can't expect magic to happen. Obviously AI works best if you have a lot of data with no insights. And if you don't have the data, like you're not going to win either way. So
it's a good point. But a human couldn't do that either. So Allie, predictions.
Okay. So first, we're not going to get to the autonomous SOC. I just need to say that because even with where things are today, the reality is, and I say this every time this comes up, like I've seen this as a hacker, that like ultimately what my job as a hacker is to find ways around technology, right? And so that doesn't change even if we have AI in the loop, because as we've seen, people love to try to find ways around AI and try to find gaps in it. And so no matter what, we're going to have some level of security operations that has to be managed by people. Now that said, I am going to bring down my expectations a little bit as to what we're going to reach in the next 2 to 3 years. I would really, really love something like task agents that are going to be able to perform triage across a variety of domains really well. Like, I think that alone would be fantastic. Because one of my fears is that, like, coming back to this alert volume thing, with the need to create more or cooler features that vendors think will differentiate them, they leave behind features that are kind of half finished, right? Which leads to the volume of alerts that we see. We're not doing that as well as we need to, but because we've moved on to other things like generative AI. And so if we can get something that does triage exceptionally well and saves the analyst that time, or even let's go totally wild and do investigation as well, that would be incredible. That would be a game changer for security operations, no doubt. I would love to see a bunch of SOC analysts that get to be threat hunters or get to be detection engineers instead of having to triage those alerts. And I do think that that's achievable in the next 2 to 3 years. Now, if we want to go further beyond that, I think if we can get to the point where we have a complete, like talking about outcomes, if we can use agentic AI to better understand the entirety of the attack surface and the subset of that is the detection surface, and then also evaluate and understand our coverage more dynamically from a detection perspective, that would be so cool. Like those are things that aren't very flashy or shiny, but would be insanely, insanely helpful for security teams. So I know that it's not as exciting, but that would just make my day.
No, I think it's totally fair. I mean, Joe hit on it. You hit on it. Understanding your environment is kind of the first step. Everything stems from that. Your detections are only as good as the context of your environment. Investigations are only as good as the context of your environment, and AI needs all of those things to be accurate in order for it to be accurate. Otherwise, you're just kind of feeling around in the dark to figure things out. Well, this was an awesome conversation. I really appreciate both of you for taking the time, sharing your insights. I know a lot of it kind of got in the weeds. Hopefully we got everybody a good sample set of what agentic AI is, the differences between generative and machine learning, how you should be evaluating it, just some thoughts around what it's good at, what it's not good at, and some of the futurescape of what we could expect. If any of the audience has questions, ReliaQuest will be on. Allie will not. ReliaQuest will be on and take questions in the chat. But I really appreciate both of your time. Thanks so much, and I look forward to the next one.
Thanks so much. This was so fun.
Yeah, thanks, guys.